Yes, good morning again. I am Markus Kaakinen. I come from the University of Helsinki, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss the current youth crime trends in Nordic region. My presentation is going to take about 30 minutes. It's going to rely mostly on publicly available crime data, but also to some degree with self-reported, international self-reported delinquent study. And I'm going to discuss first some trends in youth violent crime, and then some self-reported findings, and I'm going to finish with some words on youth street gangs or youth juvenile street gangs, that we have had this Nordic project that has concentrated on those. And if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer them on when I during the presentation as well. Anyway, this is probably not something that would surprise any of you, but in most of the Nordic countries we have been discussing youth crime quite extensively during past years, and it's also partly colliding with the organized crime situation. And I usually like to start my presentation by separating youth crime from another crime phenomena. Yet it's distinct, but still it's also connected obviously to other crime, like more organized networks. And probably we're going to have a possibility today also to discuss about these connections. But still, youth crime and youth violent crime is different from the violent crime by organized crime networks, for example. This is also something that probably doesn't come as news to you guys. Let's start by having a brief look at the recent violent crime trends among Nordic youth. And I'm going to rely on the data I found from the publicly available statistics. I'm going to mention the sources. But this is also something that I'm happy if we have opportunity to discuss more about Nordic crime data, because this is actually something that we could improve. We could have more available comparative crime data from Nordic region. Some examples, for example, we do classify crimes slightly differently. In many countries we do talk about crimes against persons, which involves violent crime, including sex crimes, for example. And in Finland, it's easier to separate other violent crime from sex crimes, for example. And also not having them in one place is also something that requires work, obviously. So maybe in 5 or 10 years we should have we should do more reporting, comparative reporting on the police recorded crime as well. It should be something that is easily findable, not something that you would have to spend a couple of hours to find. So excuse me, the data that I'm going to present next is not exactly comparable. It's going to show quite similar trends actually concerning the violent crimes, but we should remember that it involves different kinds of crime, and in some cases it is adjusted for the youth size of the youth population, but in most cases not. Okay, let's start from Finland, if I may, and we can see. Do we have the laser pointer thing? Can you? Okay, so I'm gonna just verbally explain it to you. But from the Finland, of the left-hand side picture, we can see that actually what we cannot see here, we should probably start with the crime drop phenomenon. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the crime drop. So the youth crime and other types of crime, including homicides, they were dropping from 90s or 80s, and even in 2000, the previous decade also shows some decrease in youth crime. But during the recent past 10 years, we have started seeing increase in police recorded crimes, and this actually concerns all Nordic countries to some degree. And also something that I would like to have opportunity to discuss today is that the increase starts approximately at the same time, around 2016. In Finland, we can see the line there, that it starts increasing in 2016 and so on. And in Finland, it can partly be explained by legislation changes. The obligation to report violence against children and young persons changed at that time, which quite likely has resulted in more increased reporting of violence against young people, which is, as we all probably know, mostly committed by other young people. But I don't know actually if there has been similar kind of legislation changes in other Nordic countries. But the crime trend seems to behave quite similarly. In Norway, the violence of young people charged of violence and maltreatment in Norway, we can see pretty similar kind of trend. So it starts not as intensively as in Finland, but still we see increase during the end of the last decade. This is to elaborate a bit the Finnish trend. This is from the article by me and Kimmo Haapakangas. And we can see that the increase in Finland has most to do with young adolescents aged under 15. And like we can see that the older youth groups, it has been increasing till the end of the last decade, but still it's not on historical levels, or it's not at the same level than it used to be in the beginning of 2000s. But for the young people aged under 15, they are higher now than since 80s. And this is also something that we probably have opportunity to discuss today, that's how much of this increase is actually explained of the fact that the violence between younger children is more often a police matter these days, and to what degree is it explained by the actual increase in violent behavior. There is something like it would be surprising if changes in legislation, for example, wouldn't affect at all the likelihood of reporting. But still, there's also evidence that suggests that there's also some changes in the violent behavior itself, and it's related to more severe types of violence. I'm going to talk a bit more about these later, but this is still something that we should elaborate. The increase has mostly to do with the youngest age group among youth. Okay, let's continue with the Nordic trend analysis. In Sweden, we can also see that the violent crime or crimes against person, so it includes sex crime here, increased in 2016. Then we saw some decrease during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then increase again. And then there's statistics that I was happy to receive from the National Commissioner, Police Commissioner of Iceland. And there, once more, we can see that increase started in 2015 and has continued since. And Denmark, I wasn't able, it's probably just me, but I wasn't able to find data on suspected crimes or charges, but I did find data on victimization. And once more, the violent crime by adolescents is mainly targeted against other young people. So and put it another way around, the victims of violence at that age are mostly victimized by other young people. But there again, we can see an increase in two age groups, adolescents aged 10 to 14 and 15 to 19. And once more, the magical year seems to be 2016. but the increase after that hasn't been that linear in neither of the groups, and actually there's a decrease during past 2 years in the younger group. And then to some characteristics of Finnish street violence or violence. And this is actually something that's, at least according to media and some anecdotal information, it's something that is, most of these are shared between the Nordic countries again. Once more, I would be happy to see more comparative research in Nordic context on the characteristics of violence as well. But to some main characteristics, young people with foreign background are overrepresented in suspected violent crimes. However, the violence by young people with immigration background does not explain the increase in Finland during the past years. According to the Finnish Federal Bureau of Investigation and their recent report, even if you take off this group from the statistics, we would still see the similar kind of increase. And actually it had increased slightly more among young people without immigration background. So at the same time as we should recognize that there is something that we could probably do more in preventing crime in this youth group, still the increase isn't explained away by this group, even though some political discourses like to put it that way. And this is something that also would be highly interesting to compare between Nordic countries. And crimes are not concentrated in big cities, according to the Finnish report once more. So it had increased in smaller cities and in countryside municipalities as well. So it wasn't a Helsinki area limited phenomena, for example. And also there has been changes in the types or characteristics of committed violence. And according to police, they had found more bladed weapons when they had been investigating youth street violence. And at least in Iceland, this is also, I guess, a trend, but I'm not aware of other Nordic countries. So please inform me later if you can. And also, Finnish police has been talking about humiliative violence and videoed violent acts. So this was also something that was mentioned more than it used to be during the past years when police were investigating street violence or violence taking place in public places. And also groups. According to the report by me and Kimmo Haapakangas, we found that especially during the COVID years, the violence was more often than before committed by groups. Yet it decreased after the COVID years. But also, and another thing here that I probably should have added on the slide as well is that police is more often investigating other crimes as well when they are investigating violent crime by young people. So they happen more often in situations where something else illegal takes place as well. Okay, then, like I told you, the problem of police recorded crime is comparability. We do have slightly different ways of operationalizing or legislating violence, and even more so in doing our crime statistics. Like I discussed earlier, we have different ways of classifying or grouping crimes. So it's not easy to compare countries with police recorded crimes, even in Nordic region, which are quite similar in many criminal policy, in terms of criminal policy. So for international comparison, we should have also survey data. And the Strengths, it is also something that you all probably know already, that we the phenomena called hidden crime refers to the part of the crime that is never reported to police. And it's also not random which crimes are reported to police. For example, in Finland, the volume in assaults by young people comes from the basic assaults, even though that we know that most of the violence between young people is less severe. So we should have more crimes from the less and less crimes, the more severe the crime is. However, the less severe acts are much less likely to be reported to police, obviously. So the only way to study the hidden crime or the total crime is surveys. So in that way, we can also study the proportion of crimes that people do or experience but are never reported to police. So even with these beautiful and easily interpretable lines here, they only represent the part of the crime that was reported to the police. So the actual level of crime is always higher than this. So okay, we need self-reported surveys, and the international, how many of you are aware of international self-reported delinquent studies? Okay. I'm happy to see this many hands. But anyway, so the point is quite logical. It's to do similar kind of self-reported surveys in different countries and pay some attention on translating the surveys in as comparative manner as possible. So in the ISRD fourth, the previous round of this research, all Nordic countries were represented, and this hasn't, at least in the ISRD 3, it didn't happen. I don't know if it ever happened before that all Nordic countries were actually represented. We can discuss more about the survey and the more technical issues, but let's now go to the main findings. So the level of crime, it varies between countries, but also between the different types of crime. For example, in property crime, we see that it was most prevalent. It involved, we asked if young people had committed during the past 12 months shoplifting, other kind of theft, and vandalism. At least it might involve a fourth one as well, but at least those. And it was most prevalent in Iceland and Norway, while on the other hand, the violent crime, including assaults, participating in group fights and extortion at least, was most prevalent in Finland and followed by Denmark, and least prevalent in Sweden. So it seems that the level of criminal behavior varies between even Nordic countries, but also between crime types. It is also that I would like to see more research on. Why is it so? This is a slide. All the findings are preliminary, by the way. They haven't been published yet. So when you see the papers out, they might have been elaborated a bit. But anyway, this is a comparison between ISRD 3 that was collected in 2012 to 2014 to ISRD 4 that was collected in 2020 to 2022. So in Finland, and another disclaimer here actually, the ISRD 4 is not a country comparison, it's city comparison. So we have 2 cities from each country, so the data is not representative at the country level actual. In Finland we had same cities, Turku and Helsinki, participating each time, so it's time series it's quite robust. But in Denmark, for example, we have different cities participating in different years. Anyway, if we take it as a weak signal at least, there was no statistically significant changes in assaults in Finland or in Denmark. Even we see some differences, they are not statistically significant. Group fights was more prevalent in Denmark in the recent study than it was in the earlier one. And also, and this is statistically significant, carrying weapons had increased in Denmark. Yet, we cannot tell if it's only the manner of changing the cities we were studying. So we shouldn't give too much. We shouldn't rely on this information too much. And the extortion had decreased in Denmark, but it also wasn't statistically significant. So the main take from here is that there's not many statistically significant changes in youth violence according to the self-reported surveys. The weapon carrying was increased in Denmark, though. Now, a couple of words about street gangs, because obviously during past years, how much time do I have, by the way? 10 minutes. Okay, yeah, it should be enough. So during the past 5 years or so, we have been discussing quite much about the organized gang crimes in Sweden and the violence and other crimes by these networks. Sometimes it gets mixed with juvenile street gangs or youth gangs or problematic youth groups. And that's why I'd like to start by defining what I mean by youth street gangs. These findings are based on our Nordic project, which included, in addition to myself, Heidi Lommel from Norway, not here today, okay, and then Kim Møller from Denmark, or from the University of Malmö actually, but he was in charge of the Danish data collection. Amir Rostami from Sweden, and Lars Westfeldt from Sweden, and then Margaret Valdimarsdottir from Iceland. I guess Margaret is also not here today. Okay. So luckily I'm here. So the background of the study was that we need, like I started my today's talk, that we would need as much comparative Nordic research knowledge as possible, and also we needed an up-to-date and comparative information on youth or juvenile gangs, and it was based on the ISRD4. We had Næstved and Randers, cities from Denmark, Helsinki and Turku from Finland, Reykjavik, and other than Reykjavik, it means the surrounding areas of Reykjavik area, and Oslo from Norway, Stockholm and Gävle from Sweden. I'm not going to spend too much time on the definitional issues here, but the problem with street gangs have been that we haven't agreed much on what actually is a street gang. The study on street gangs started from Chicago and other big American cities, and it mainly concentrated on gangs with a long history and many generations, and which were actually quite sizable. But later we have come to acknowledge more and more that there are street gangs around the world and in different kinds of environment. They are just not exactly similar. And the leading definition in comparative street gang research is a Eurogang definition. It actually distinguishes the definers, which means that certain characteristics are shared by all street gangs. And they are all durable, street-oriented youth groups whose involvement in illegal activity is part of the group identity. This is very general, obviously, so it can involve youth groups that hang in a mall and do vandalism. But it can also include groups that consist of young adults also, and which already participates in, to some degree, organized criminal activities. But this is not problem according to Eurogang research framework, because it also has descriptors. So it's important what kinds of street gangs are we talking about and which kind of street gangs are we studying. And today we are studying or concentrating on juvenile street gangs. I will actually describe them more as I go further, but this is highly important. They are very different from the Swedish street gangs, for example, the more organized street gangs that actually shouldn't even be called street gangs anymore. Okay, our preliminary findings that should be out in the Journal of European Journal of Criminology quite soon, I hope. But anyway, so all Nordic cities have youth groups that can be defined as youth or juvenile street gangs. And the differences between cities were mainly not significant. Helsinki did differ from the Reykjavik surrounding areas and Oslo, but the other cities, they are approximately the same. But there is one city that stands out, and it's Stockholm. And this is actually also, they did have a similar kind of street gang measure in ISRD2 in the beginning of 2000s. And all the other cities, the prevalence is pretty much the same as it used to be 20 years ago or so. But Stockholm is different. It's doubled compared to Turku, for example. And also another interesting observation is that Gävle is in the middle of the other Nordic cities, so it's not a Swedish phenomenon according to these findings, it's Stockholm. And I cannot help wondering that if we had Malmö or Göteborg, if we would find something pretty similar to Stockholm, would be interesting to elaborate. But according to our correlates we studied, the young people who are most likely to be involved in these kind of groups are the ones that have high criminal propensity, though they have pro-crime attitudes and they show different types of illegal behaviors. They also have lower self-control and social control. They have higher peer delinquency and victimization experiences. At the city level, the likelihood of belonging to a street gang was higher in the cities with, on average, or higher aggregated pro-delinquency attitudes and higher aggregated, on average, experienced strain and perceived discrimination. These didn't explain involvement in youth gangs at the individual level. So individuals who had higher perceived discrimination or family strain were not more or less likely to belong to a street gang than average other adolescents. But at the city level, so it might have something to do with the concentrated strain and discrimination experiences. Okay, that's a technical part that I will skip because due to my time limit, I can probably explain you item response theory later. But we also studied that does belonging to a street gang actually communicate or mean, does it indicate severe criminal behavior on average? And I can explain you later the parameters of difficulty and discrimination, but I will just go to findings now. So to summarize our findings on the Nordic project, the prevalence of youth gangs did not significantly differ between Nordic cities that much. All cities have youth groups that commit violence together and that could be defined as group that participating in criminal behavior is part of their identity. They accept and do crimes together, not just that members do crimes, but they do it together. But the Stockholm is different, and we should actually, according to some additional analysis, the groups mainly consist of young people, so they didn't have adult members. Only 1 or 2% of the young people belonged to a group that had members older than 18 years old. So they are adolescents-limited groups mostly. And at the individual level, the gang membership is mostly predicted by the criminal propensity. low exposure to social control, and neighborhood disorganization. But at the city level, the strain seems to predict more the membership. And according to the item response theory analysis, the gang membership does not require particularly high criminal propensity. So young people who belong to a gang, it does not reflect higher criminality than us. Sorry, I can actually check it from here. It's not different from vandalism, carrying a weapon, group fighting, or selling drugs, which are, of course, like all crimes, worrisome, of course. But it only differs from the shoplifting. So belonging to this kind of group reflects higher criminal propensity than shoplifting, but it didn't differ from the following crimes. Assault, extortion, and burglary require higher criminal behavior or propensity than belonging to a street gang. So it's also, according to the discrimination, it doesn't work well as identifying the serious criminal offenders also. So young people who belongs to this kind of group, it doesn't indicate strong, more severe criminal behavior than vandalism, for example. So if we want to identify young people who most likely show severe criminal behavior, we should concentrate more on group fighting, selling drugs, assaulting others, or extortion or burglary. So even though the gang obviously has a bad connotation related to it, these adolescent street gangs are different from the organized gangs we mostly talk about. And it could be seen as one way of delinquency, which is not qualitatively that different from some of the most common types of offending. Yet, obviously, we would hope, and we are working hard here today to prevent that as well. So none of them are something that we like to see, obviously. Thank you.